So, quick announcement. A friend of ours is looking for an editor of his middle grade books. He's sold many, many copies of these books. He's doing really well.
They're self-published.
They're self-published. They're called, what are those called?
Evertaster
books. So Adam Sidwell. So if you're an editing student or a professional editor and looking for a job, I'm going to write an email up here. You can get some information from April. But also remember that we have copies of the lectures up at the URL that I'll stick up here.
So he's going to put two things up here. One's the URL for the copies of these lectures that are going on my website, and the second one's an email if you want to contact Adam. He just asked us if we'd ask the class. He's looking for, it's a paid thing. He wants to pay some people to do editing for him. He's looking for editing students, so I said I'd mention it. You have those cards, Isaac? Yes. So, questions. Here we are. We're about halfway through, aren't we? I would say now. Yeah, about halfway. So, how's it going with your writing this semester? What's that? Not halfway done. Not halfway done? Specifically those who are not in the workshop class, how's your writing going? Are you doing it? Are you actually achieving something? We have gone through all of the basics of what I wanted to cover in the class, one hit on each thing. Today we're going to delve into prose a lot more deeply, and the idea of show versus tell and concrete description and all of these lovely things. But you've had a taste of basically everything, so let's see what you guys are interested in knowing from me. By the way, I brought goodies, so thank you for. Yes, question.
So you get stuck writing because you think that maybe something makes sense. Do you just keep writing and fix it later, or do you?
Good question. I get stuck writing because things don't make sense. This comes down to how well do I know my own writing style. And part of what I'm trying to get you to do in this class is learn your own writing style. And style more, in that case, I'm talking about more the idea of learn what works for you, what encourages you to write. For me, if something isn't working, it could be one of many different things. One could be, I just don't feel like writing that day, right? Sometimes it just, it doesn't work, right? And no matter how much you want to force it, it just doesn't come together. And on those days, I write it anyway, I set it aside, and the next day I reread it, and I see, was this really as bad as I thought it was? And sometimes it is. And so then I start over. Usually, my subconscious has been working on it to the point that I know kind of how good or how not good it was, and my subconscious works on how to fix it, and the next day then I'm excited to write it again because I've worked out how to fix this problem. Sometimes that doesn't happen, and it is legitimately a problem, and so I keep writing, and I see how much it impacts the book. If it is a major character thing that's not working, at some point I have to stop and start that character over. And that is like my last resort, because I know if I stop and start over, it can be very damaging to the book. For me, momentum, this is part of my writing style, momentum is like king on making a book work. And coming back to something after losing my momentum or starting over can be really hard on that book and on me. Now, it can be worth it. There are books where I've done that, and it has come out wonderfully. But I try everything I can do to not do that. Firefight, which I just finished, had one major problem in the magic system. One of the characters' superpowers, it's the superhero books, just wasn't working right for me. But the characters, who they are, and their emotional contact with the other characters and all these things was fine. And so I was able to write the whole book and then get done and say, okay, here's what I need to have happen. And then I brainstormed with my, my team, and we came up with what would make that all work. And now I can go revise and repaint that and make everything work. When I was working on the Mistborn books, there was a character in the third book who was not working, and it was the character's own emotional connection to the book. And for me, that just is not something I can paint over later. I had to stop, rebuild the character from the get-go, and rewrite their conflict and who they were. So it just depends on the situation. Do you want a Kolos, do you want Sil, or do you want Zeph? Sil. No. It was the person who asked the question. Kolos? All right, here's a Kolos. So these are things I like have people bring their come to signings and like bring their kids, right? And their kids will be like there in line just bored, and they get up the front. And I feel so bad for these kids, so I pull out, I'm like, here's a sticker. They're so excited. They're like the Mistborn temporary tattoos, which are like awesome for adults, but for the kids they're like, oh good, a circle with a spike. So I had Isaac work with some artists, and we got a little Sil sticker and a little Kolos sticker that I can be like, here's a monster or a little fairy thing. So, all right, questions. Oh, now there's a lot. Go for it. Yes, okay, great.
So I'm pretty good at coming up with scenes, but I'm struggling with coming up with in-between stuff.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so you can come up with like powerful climactic scenes, or
well, either climatic or fun, just like things that actually
right.
have something.
But you're having trouble filling in the gaps. Boy, this is going to be a difficult one for me to quote unquote diagnose, because I've known people who are like this, and the way they write their books, which is like fundamentally bizarre to me. It's like I can't even conceive it. Is they write all these cool scenes and they just keep writing them, and eventually they put them together and string them together in a book and do a revision to make it all flow together. And they just keep writing fun scenes no matter what. I can't comprehend that. That just doesn't work for me at all, because I don't know where the character is emotionally, but that's how they film movies, right? Actors can do this. That's one way you could approach it. If you're writing great fun scenes, that's like the best first world problem to have, right? You're like, I don't know what goes in between, but I've got these great fun scenes. That's good. My advice, if I were running into this problem, for me, I would say, well, what can I do to make a fun, cool scene that strings together these other two ones that I've designed? Obviously, that scene is boring to you. You need to find things that are exciting. Can I change the viewpoint? That is not like, can I do it from the viewpoint of, if I'm just like bored with a book and feel like I'm in a rut, I do a one-off viewpoint. I can do this in epic fantasy very easily with the third-person thing. I'm like, all right, the waiter. I'm going to make the waiter really interesting, and he's going to come in and serve all these bizarre characters of mine and be like, oh no, you know, and be involved, or something like that. Or the wall guard, or something like this. Let's make them fascinating, change the viewpoint, shake it up. Or can I put it in a different setting? I will often be like, this scene, I need this scene. It's important. It strings together these two scenes, but it feels like it's just going to be painting by numbers. Let's put it somewhere really visually interesting and then have some motion going on. Can you have something happen in the scene, unexpected, that's only a small little thing, but can force you to have this, make this scene work? Can you go watch some of your favorite movies, particularly good action movies, and see what they will do for scenes where they have to get across, transition from point A to point B. And the good ones will always have something interesting happening. Somebody's operating on someone else. Bones is operating on someone while they're having a conversation. Or, it's on Hoth, and Han and everyone are arguing, but they're running through the tunnels while snow is falling down, and C-3PO is like getting locked away. But this is exposition is what they're doing while they're doing it. Can you find whatever that is for your book and make it work? Avoid the episode 1, 2, 3 problem, which is we take a stroll and talk about it in order to advance the plot. Lots of strolling in those movies. Avoid the strolling. Look for something to happen, okay? Try some things like that. This is a great problem to have, because if you're writing good scenes, all you really need to do is figure out how to make more good scenes. Zeph, Sil, or a Kolos? So, okay, I don't surprise you. Okay. Well, I've got more of these, so there you are. If you haven't read my books, it makes no sense to you, but there you go. All right, right here.
What do you do for revising? Do you kind of revise as you go, or finish
Oh, good question.
draft?
Revising. Yeah. So you can give that to, there are people in this room that would love that. So revision. Revision is one of these things. I hate revision, right? I absolutely loathe it. One of the reasons it took me so long to get published is because I would never revise my books. I would write a new one instead, right? I told you guys this in class. I'd be like, I could do this better, and then write a new book. I eventually had to learn how to revise. My process for revision, and what I found worked very well, is to make it very goal-based. In other words, I identify what do I want to achieve in this draft, and I work toward that. Now, what I want to achieve can be varied. Thanks, Corbett. So we have what we call polishing drafts. Polishing drafts, and this fits in a lot with what we're talking about today. So I'll do some more Q&A, but this is kind of part of our whole prose thing. So it's good to do a revision lecture. This will be a little bit longer than the other questions that I might answer. So you've got a polishing draft. Now, a polishing draft, the goal is to clean up the language, okay, and make the language better. So you are looking for things. This is where you're really looking for show versus tell, right? When you get to something, you've got this paragraph where you're like, wow, can I show this in a few lines instead of this big bulky paragraph? Can I cut out, most of us repeat ourselves. We do this in language a lot, but we do it on the page. What you'll see a lot of times is a character will say something, and then they'll do what they said, and then the narrative will explain what they just did. And you really only need one of those three, depending on the scene. So a lot of times, particularly journeyman writers, will show then tell, or tell then show, because they don't quite trust themselves yet. And I do this a lot still too. You repeat ideas, you get things across. So cutting is really important in a polishing draft. Looking for the right word. Oftentimes, being a master of diction and word choice is not about using large words, it's about using the right word. When you can find one word that replaces another word, yet increases the ability for the reader to understand and imagine the story, then that's what you want to do. There were times in Harriet's editing of my Wheel of Time books where I would say something, was a wooden bench, and she'd be like, what kind of wood? I'm like, well, that does make a difference. And if I change that one word, gives a little bit better of an image. It's very easy swap to make. It does not make the book any longer, but increases the visual power of the book. You don't always want to do that, but in the places you would indicate, that helps. If you say cedar or pine instead of wood, then that gives a different feel to the description. So you're looking for the right word. And we will do this a lot of times when you have an adverb. You can replace the adverb and the word before it with a better word that just means that. Instead of ran quickly, he rushed, or things like this, where suddenly you've got, you're giving the correct word in case. So, looking for the right word, you're just looking to increase clarity. And if that's your gig, beauty of the language, depending on the story. Now, I've talked before about the idea of window pane prose. I'll go into that a little bit more. But, what your goals are for your prose. You're looking to do these things. So how do you do this? Well, when I'm doing a polishing draft, will often be reading through the book only to do the polishing draft. I'm not looking for other things. I keep my eyes focused on this. There are writers who will read their book backward in order to do the polishing draft. They start with the last paragraph, polish that, and then move up in order to polish. Mary likes to read her book out loud to polish. Reading out loud helps a lot with a polishing draft. However you do it, that's a separate type of draft. Now, what you were probably asking more about is the kind of the editing draft, the major changes draft. So what I do is my very first draft, I am a quintessential outliner, which is what we call a one drafter, which is like, I don't stop. I have to have momentum. I start at the beginning and I write straight through this thing, often chronologically, or at least chronologically by character viewpoint. And that is draft number 1. And that can be really bad, right? Draft 1. That's my 1.0 equals bad. The reason for it being bad is because I am this style of writer, if I come up with a better idea mid-stride, I have to just change the book as if it is going toward that new idea, and I do not revise what's come before. I add characters, I drop characters, I add plot archetypes, I do all kinds of things like this in the middle of chapters and don't bring the rest of the book up to speed because momentum is so important for me. I've got this great outline, I keep my momentum and keep the outline going as I write, and I go straight through. So when you read this, you will often be like, wow, well, you should never read this. In fact, when I finish this, I send to the company, don't read this, because you're like, wow, this is really bad. You're like, where'd this character come from? You can watch me doing this on Warbreaker, by the way, which is the one I wrote and posted the chapters online as I did it. Like in one of the first third, I'm like, I don't need this character, and they just vanish. No explanation. They're just not there anymore. Things like that. So, draft 1. Draft 2, then, is where I fix this. I fix the big problems. And what I do when I'm writing draft 1 is I have a file open. Notes for next revision is what we call it right now. And I will be keeping in this thing comments to myself about things that need to be changed. There's not very many by the time I'm done with draft 1 because they're only the big things and I really kind of know what they are. Really, while I'm doing this draft is when I'm really filling in the notes for next revision because I am noticing smaller scale things that need to be fixed, but I'm not focusing on those right now. I'm fixing the big problems. I'm putting this in a place where a reader could actually read this, enjoy the book, and yes, they'll notice problems, but they won't be problems like, why, Brandon, does this entire plot device be dropped? Or why did their magic change to a different magic entirely? To make it cohesive. So I'm keeping a list there. And then draft 3 is my first polish. And during the polish, I'm also filling out my notes for next revision, where I'm really not trying to fix any of these things. I'm just looking for problems and keeping them in my file. At that point, I send draft 3 to my editor and my agent, and to my writing group, usually, though sometimes they get draft 1 and 2 or whatever. And I solicit feedback, which when the feedback comes, I add to my notes for next revision, all this feedback. And then we do draft 4, which is kind of usually the big one. This is the big hard one. This is where, you'd think that draft 2 would be, because there are major problems I'm fixing, but I'm still excited about the book. I'm eager to get it into people's hands. I now know the things that I changed, how good they are later in the book, so it's easy to fix them in the first part. Draft 4 is where it's like, man, I need to fix this character that I thought was working just fine. Or, man, I need to cut this whole thing out. Or, oh, the book is just not funny enough. I need to enhance the humor a great deal. Or just the hard things that you get when your editor calls and is like, there's not enough tension in this book, Brandon. You've got to amp it up by like 200%, or things like this. And so I will go to my notes for next revision file, and I will usually organize them by severity. So I have like major problems, medium problems, little things, and I keep this file open, and they've got bullet points of all the stuff I want to fix, and I keep this open as I read through the book from the beginning, and I'm looking actively for ways to change these things as I go. And I'm often making notes underneath them, changed here, fix this. When I get something completely done, usually the medium ones are something I can fix in one chapter, and I can just move off the list, and I'll move them down below or strike them out and things like this. And this document is on, nowadays is on our SkyDrive so that Peter and Isaac can access it at the same time, and my editor in New York can, and they can be adding things and dynamically changing it as I am, and things like that. But that's not something you really need to be worried about doing. But this whole thing, and then I usually finish it, and my goal is to have most of these things taken care of, and most of these things by the time I'm done with draft 4, so that these things can all then move up. And then my big problems are not so big anymore. And then after that, it's basically bug fixing. Sometimes I have to do a draft 5 that is as big as draft 4. But after that, bug fixing, and then I'll end with a polish. So I do a polish at draft 3, and then whatever the last draft is. So, and that's my methodology. Now, that's very different from a lot of my friends who are discovery writers. So when Jancy comes in to talk to you, ask her how she handles revision, because she has a very different process, and she's quite good at revision. So I'll just let her tell you about her methods, and that might help you guys approach revision from a different standpoint as well. All right? Do you want a Kolos, a Sil, or a Zeth? Kolos. Rawr. He's ready to eat some heads. All right, let's do another couple questions. In the back, go ahead.
So if you're draft 1,
yes.
You know is bad. Like, do you ever get halfway through and realize that it's bad and you want to start over, or do you always finish out the first bad draft and then go back and make it?
I finish the draft unless it is. I very rarely don't. There are 2 or 3 occasions where I've not finished it. And those are all individual enough I can tell you each of them. You can kind of maybe get some perspective there. I did not finish a book. The first book I never finished was called Mythwalker. I was writing it during an era where I'd written Elantris, Dragonsteel, White Sand, and I'd been sending these big epic fantasies off, and they weren't selling, and I got kind of discouraged, and I felt that Mythwalker was too generic, that it just felt like what I'd done before. It was like Dragonsteel yet again, and I got just really bored with the book, and I stopped. That's dangerous. I also think that the magic was broken and just didn't work at all, which is bad for me in a book. Another book that I didn't finish was Death by Pizza, which is Necromancer who owns a pizza delivery joint, which is me experimenting with urban fantasy. And it was done as an experiment for fun between 2 other books. I do that a lot, and I don't always release those books. Alcatraz was one of these that turned out all right. Arithmetist was too. Death by Pizza was not. It just didn't work. The book as a whole. It was a fun thing that I tried doing for fun. Recursion is fun too. And at the end of the day, I'd like, hey, I learned a whole lot. This wasn't meant for publishing. It didn't go anywhere good. The big problem with Death by Pizza is the whole fantasy side of it just never worked. It didn't feel like a real underworld to an urban culture. And so I didn't finish the book. Just didn't work. But my goals for it were to practice. Another book I think I may have finished, but I never did the revisions on it, was a book called Lyre of Partenelle, which I was unsatisfied with it as just a quality thing. I was discovery writing a little too much on that, and it didn't end up working for me. I just didn't like the book. I actually finished that one and never revised it. So it's different every time. It's very dangerous for me if I put down a book. Like there are some that I've written like 4 or 5 chapters on and put down. Like getting back into that book ever is just almost impossible. And so putting down a book is a bad idea for me, particularly if it's a book I have a contract for. That's bad. And so I look to avoid that at all times. It can be different for other people. You could have it, but I recommend generally for new authors, particularly when your skill is still developing, to finish books. If you don't learn to finish, you will never finish, and you will never gain those skills, and you will always be disappointed with what you're writing because you will never progress as quickly as you need to if you aren't actually finishing things. Okay? What do you want? Zeth, Sil, a Kolos. The Kolos. There you are. Munch, munch, munch. All right, what was your question?
Well, related to what you just said.
Uh-huh.
Finishing a book.
Uh-huh.
How do you have any short recommendations for how to finish a novel-length book for someone who's never done one before?
Yeah, just do it. Every person I've known personally who's their first book that they finished, the ending has been a disaster, even myself. Okay? You just can't learn this without doing that. Some people, I guess, can. But my first book, I did the classic thing. Both Dan and I did this. We were writing along. We felt it was long enough. We said, I'm going to end it now. Boom. I got much better with my second book. And so how do you end it? You've got to just do this. And it's probably, most of us, our endings are just going to be like, well, and now this is the ending. As newer writers, as journeyman writers, really in this class I would call you journeyman writers, you are getting to the point where you can create a good scene. You're getting to the point where you can create an interesting character quirk or a great magic system or all these things. What you can't do yet is put it all together into a novel. And that is something you just have to practice. So advice on ending, if you haven't ended before, having an ending in mind and writing toward it and just doing that ending. If you get along, you're like, this ending doesn't really work anymore, but I don't have anything better, just going ahead and writing that ending would probably be a good suggestion for you. But yeah. All right. What do you want? Zeth. All right. Zeth punches out and stands up. But he doesn't stand up real well. I actually brought you the seconds. We just got these in, and they made the little thing on the front not the hole is too big, so you'll find after you punch him out, he doesn't stand up particularly well. So we're having him reprinted, and those will stand up. So you'll have to figure out your own way to make him stand up, to be a Zeth stand-up figure. But if you, Isaac found out if you cut off another piece of this plastic and wedge another piece in, it just, the hole is twice as wide as the plastic piece that's supposed to make him stand up. So there you go. I'm sorry, you get the seconds. All right, let's do one or two more. You've had your hand up a couple times.
This is very possibly too
long
to be answered here, but I'm struggling a little bit with voice. I find that I've got 5 different character voices.
Okay, that's good. Are they 5 different characters?
Yes, but they're the same in everything I write.
Oh, 5 different character voices, the same. Okay.
That's my range.
Oh boy, you're just gonna have to. Yeah, I think that's a matter of practicing and asking yourself, what are these voices? What's happening with them? Go practice. One thing I've heard people doing in a situation like this is taking famous books and trying to imitate the voices of those characters and seeing if you can do that. It's the whole thing that artists learn. All right, now learn to paint like an impressionist. Okay, now learn to paint like this. Try doing that and see what you can learn from imitating those character voices. Like if you can do Matt Cawthon, that's a really hard voice to do. Trust me. If you can do Quoth, Matt Cawthon from The Wheel of Time, you can do Quoth. He's got a really cool, distinctive voice. What's some other good voices? If you can do J.K. Rowling's prose voice, is really distinctive, right? Go read her prose, not her character dialogue, but her prose voice. Imitate that. Go grab anything that's got a strong voice. A lot of the teen books have really strong voices. Pick up those and try and imitate them. See if you can do those and see where you go. All right? What do you want?
Zeth.
All right. All right. We'll have a lot of Zeths that aren't standing up well. All right. We're going to go right here.
You want to know what your writing rituals are? Are there things you do before you write?
Besides check Twitter. No, I don't have a lot of writing rituals. I'm a very workman-like writer. I write every day when I can. Obviously, sometimes I can't. But I get up, I turn on music, and I write. I do read my scriptures first. We're at BYU, we can talk about that. If I don't read my scriptures first, then I don't get to them. But if I read them first, it's like, hey, I have to read my scriptures now. And I want to write every day, and I do write every day, basically. And so if I've read my scriptures before I write, then I've read my scriptures every day. So I guess that's a writing ritual. But otherwise, I don't do anything wacky. I do have a tread desk. Tread desks are nice. You put the little computer up on the thing, and you walk while you type and things like that. It's very nice. So there you are. What do you want? You want a Zeth? All right, I'm going to throw one to you. I think they might fly all right. Woo! Oh, hey! He's an assassin. That's what he does. All right, see if you can get those to stand up. All right, let's do one more. Okay, we're here.
So, I have a character that's basically a dog.
Okay.
I'm really trying to I'm struggling with limiting his power set appropriately in such a way that will make it so that he can possibly be involved in action, but not dominate.
Yeah, ask Howard about this when he comes in. I'm going to give you some answers, but Howard ran into this exact problem in his comic and had to come up with a solution for it, which I think has worked out pretty well. He has a god character. or a deific AI who has access to just way too much information and power. There are really a couple ways to handle this. The first way is to make the problems the character has to deal with things that their deific powers cannot solve. This is the Superman problem. Superman, when his stories are really interesting, they are problems he can't really solve with his powers. It's interpersonal things and stuff like this are the really interesting conflicts with him. The other big thing you can do is then make a conflict that is so big that only this person can deal with it. And that's kind of what Howard did, but the idea is that it takes all of this person's energy and efforts to keep this danger contained, which means that otherwise he has very little resources for everything else. But you kind of have to judge those, or you can go do the whole limitation thing. But I mean, if you want to do deific character, I mean, Superman is a deific character, right? He's a Christ figure. This is the whole thing about him. And so he can do basically anything except he can't change free will. So he can't make Lois Lane fall in love with him. So that becomes the conflict of the story. Decide which kind of direction you want to go, and you can go with that. All right, what do you want? Zeth it is. You found out that Zeth stands up, and everyone's like, oh, well, I guess I have to have Zeth now. But he doesn't stand up real well. He kind of stands up. The ones that we give out on tour will stand up. I'm going to need some more water, Corbett, would you?
Got a bit of a cough today, so.
All right, so let's talk prose. Prose. So, maybe. You actually read what I write up here?
It's a difficult art.
Yes. What's that? Is yours dry erase? Okay. Yeah, well, I have had that happen before where someone hands me something. And, well, what really happens is that sometimes you have a wet erase board and people give you dry erase markers. Apparently those two sometimes don't mix really well. I'm not convinced that this is a dry erase board anyway. All right, so prose. Encapsulated in this, we are going to talk about the idea of the basics of prose, but we're also going to talk about the idea of getting across information to your reader in a way that does not feel like an info dump. As I have said, this is the grand skill of science fiction and fantasy writers, the ability to convey setting and character, setting in particular, in a way that is engaging, that is powerful, and is not boring. So I want to talk about a few general concepts for you that are going to help you with this. The first one of these is the idea of window pane prose. Have I talked to you about window pane prose? Yeah. I've mentioned it, window pane. P-A-N-E, I think. Window pane prose. This is a concept that Dave talked about in his class, which he got from George Orwell, whose essay I've read on this, which is the idea, George Orwell's idea was that the story is a pane of, or the prose is a pane of glass through which you see a story happening. All right? And his goal was to write his prose in such a way that it never distracted you from that story happening on the other side. This is very much a paraphrase of what he said, but it's the concept has gained its own life and has grown beyond that. And a lot of people talk about this idea right now. This is generally the goal of popular fiction, is to make the prose translucent. That does not mean you have to choose this style. I want to make you aware of this style. There are plenty of authors who do not use this style. Pat Rothfuss and Tolkien. Neither of them are writing window pane prose. They're both writing prose that draws attention to itself in one way or another. And the opposite of the window pane prose is kind of the stained glass. Stained glass prose is the idea that your use of language is so powerful and evocative that readers enjoy the prose itself as kind of as part of the art, And in doing so, yes, it distracts from the story. You can't really see what's happening on the other side of the window, but you're gaining this addition to it instead. And these can, I would call things like 100 Years of Solitude, really has a lot of stained glass prose going on. It doesn't mean flowery, it doesn't mean purple. It means the author is doing very interesting things with the prose. Now, both of these are very valid. In popular fiction, we do focus on this one, and in literary programs, you'll have a lot more discussion of this style of prose. Poetry is the form of stained glass prose, usually, right? And so you're going to want to decide for yourself where you want to be on this. There is a middle ground, a lot of people say, where you run into something like I would honestly say that that people like Pat and Tolkien are really kind of in this hybrid area where they're writing this beautiful prose, but it doesn't distract usually because it's evoking character. Like in Pat's case, it's a character who's narrating this thing. It's about him. And so him using this flowery, beautiful language makes you say, this is a flowery, beautiful guy. That's what he does. And it really kind of enhances your sense of him. It does distract from the story sometimes, but the whole idea of the journey through one of his books is this beautiful prose. So you could totally do this in a market-friendly way as well as in a more artsy, literary way. But you kind of got to be aware of what you're trying to do and what your goals are. I very much write window pane prose, except for the occasional flourish here and there, where I'm like, I just got to, you know, you'll see it from me often at the beginning of a chapter. There'll be a paragraph that inches. I never quite get to Pat's level on this, but it inches that direction for a while and then withdraws. Because I really do feel that my stories, I want you to see the, the story and not the language. My famous editing notation from my editor on this is great. Like, I had one that was really great, a paragraph that was just like, it was one of the most stained glass prose paragraphs I've ever had. And it was really good. It was legit. It's not purple or anything. My editor gets to it and he circles it and he writes, Brandon, you can't be Gene Wolfe for one paragraph, and then continues on. And Gene Wolfe is a famous literary fantasy writer, and his prose is very dense and beautiful. And that there's a very important lesson there that Moshe taught, which is the idea that the more window pane you are, the more the more window pane you are, the more this will stand out and look purple, even if it's not, because of the surrounding stuff. So be aware of this. Be aware of this push and pull. Yeah.
What do you mean by look purple?
Purple prose is prose that is trying way too hard to be flowery. And in doing so, instead of using the right word, is using big words. Or instead of using a precise word, is using lots of adjectives or adverbs. And it's, you know, if you go Google purple prose, you'll find it. A lot of certain genres are famous for their purple prose. They call it purple because, I'm not sure, you have to, I remember it being explained to me once, but the whole idea is it's an author who's trying so hard to do stained glass prose, but they're so bad at it that it looks really, really bad, okay? So, yeah. Oh, you asked a question. What do you want? Sill it is. Woo! Oh, I think the Sill ones are the cutest. Sill's, well, yeah. She doesn't fly as well as Zeth does, but that's okay. She gets distracted. So, idea number 2. So be aware of this idea. I'm not saying do one or the other. I'm saying be aware of this idea. The other big thing that I like to talk about is something I learned in grad school. Yes, indeed, I did learn something in grad school for creative writing. It was from another student. It's called the pyramid of abstraction, which I absolutely loved when he explained this idea to me. The pyramid of abstraction is the idea that as your writing grows more abstract, it is more able to tackle loftier and loftier ideas, but it is harder and harder to keep your reader's attention on the story. Okay? It's this whole idea between the window pane and the stained glass, but it's pushing. So as you go more abstract, your ability to talk about cool things increases, but your ability to lose your reader increases also. And so we try to do this thing where we try to ground our prose in concrete language that will really set a scene, which then allows us to earn going more abstract and still keep their attention. You will see this often in books where people will start their first few paragraphs with a concrete description of setting before they get into the characters arguing. And as the scene progresses, you will notice less and less references to description and let the conversation go to some interesting topic. And then they'll occasionally give you, concrete references to what's going on, and then they'll bring you out of it and really solidify you back into the scene. So using this works really well to help you be able to do some of these loftier ideas, and lets you really keep your reader's attention. Whenever you run into a reader who's giving you the feedback of it feels like this is taking place in a white room, or I don't know where people are, or I'm not sure who's talking, or what they're, they want to know what the story is before you're going into whatever it is you're doing. Another thing that authors love to do a lot is what we call navel gazing. Navel gazing is a character wrestling with a deep issue with them. It is when Batman broods, right? It's when, the character is like, my father, my parents are dead. This sort of stuff. We love doing this. The problem is navel gazing goes way up this. You're like up here. You're inside the character's head. They're not thinking about things that are happening right now. They're flashbacking and all of this stuff. It's so easy to lose your reader when you do this navel gazing. Number one, you should probably keep it to a minimum. I have trouble with this. But yeah, navel gazing way up here. Named, of course, because the character's staring inward at their navel. If you want to ground people, you want to be concrete in your descriptions. So the fun thing to do with this, and if you guys have taken the class before or seen this, don't say anything, but is to talk about what really means, what is abstract and what is concrete. Where would you put the concept of love? Abstract, yes. Talking about love and what it feels. Often there's going to be navel gazing and things like this. Where would you put a dog? Dog is abstract. This is what people get wrong every time. When I say dog, who in here is imagining the same dog as the person next to them? Not a single person. This is all Play-Doh. Dogs are abstract concepts. You know what a dog is, so it's a little less abstract than love. But this is very high on the pyramid of abstraction, because when you say there's a dog in your prose, you are giving them almost nothing to a vision. Now, that may be what you're wanting to do. These are all tools. But you can pull anything down on the pyramid of abstraction by adding words. Adding words, therefore, but adding words is a dangerous thing, because the more words you add, kind of the slower your piece reads, and that has a danger of kicking people out too. So there's a balance here. But the idea is if you can add the right words and do the descriptions the right way, you can pull your setting down on the pyramid of abstraction and give a concrete indication of what's going on. So how would you describe a very concrete dog? Corgi. Okay, a corgi. Her Majesty's corgi. See, we're pulling this way down, right? Now, we're all pretty much imagining the same dog. We've moved down, and suddenly by saying Her Majesty's corgis, so corgi is great because you're able to, like I said earlier, you can pull it down a little bit on the pyramid abstraction by just using a different word. So no extra words. You've done a great job in that case. Her Majesty's corgis. So can we go a little further? Majesty's blue corgi. Okay. Her Majesty's corgi, who had recently been put in a bath, escaped, and crossed between us as we sat uncomfortably having our conversation, and then it ate one of the biscuits. Right? Sorry, I've got a bit of a cough today. So you can imagine that scene. You can imagine that little dog, right? You can dress it in a bow. You can say it's blue. It's, the corgi ran through the paint. Whatever you want to do, suddenly you are making this corgi more and more concrete, but you are adding words. Now, we want to be careful about adding words. Oftentimes, the way to be really concrete and to not add too many words is to pick one or two important details about a scene that you think will evoke the proper setting for that scene and describe those in a very concrete way using precise words and allow the reader to then imagine what goes along with this. So, the example that Dan likes to use, and he's very good at this sort of thing, is saying, you know, if you're in a room and there's bullet holes in the window, and you can describe a concrete image of the bullet holes and what the character thinks about those, then you are setting the scene in a certain room, as opposed to if you're sitting in a room and there's somebody scrubbing the window and waving at you. Two very different scenes with a concrete sort of image. You know, the squeegee man, you describe, you know, how the squeegee man looks and what the sound it makes, and suddenly you're all there in the room. Or you describe the bullet holes and the distant sounds of a siren, and the room smells of mold. Suddenly, you know, you're setting a very different scene. And so your goal is to pick a few details that evoke your scene and then describe them in a concrete way. One other thing that'll pull down is use multiple senses. Sights get used a lot in books. When you can use other senses, that information is something that, as human beings, when we read it, it will pull us in a little bit more because we're not used to reading it as often. And if it's done correctly in the context of the scene, it will pull us into this scene, and it won't kick us out by standing out too much. You do have to be aware of the grill in the phone booth. I talked about this thing before. That you have to watch when you're doing your descriptions to not mention a grill in the phone booth, which is if you were writing a story and someone's walking along and you wanted to talk about the tax forms they had to make sure they got filed, and they're just going along and they describe, they're like, and there was a gorilla in the phone booth, and they continue on. Suddenly, no one cares about the tax forms. They're like, what about, well, okay, there's somebody who cares about the tax forms, yeah. She's an accountant. But everyone else is like, gorilla, hello, gorilla. Now, this is a silly example, but it is something to watch out for, that if you sometimes give these kind of offhanded descriptions, you can really turn everyone's attention away from what's going on in the story. Yes?
Do you use that in like third-person thing in order to establish that something wrong is happening, but the main character doesn't realize it?
Sure. You can do all kinds of things. All these rules exist to be broken. You just got to be aware of what they are. All right? And I think the pyramid abstraction really helps here. So what you're trying to do here, using both of these two things, is you're trying to be conscious and intentional in the way you are approaching your prose. And you are trying to decide how much description you want to do. Now, an epic fantasy can take more description than a urban thriller, okay? In an urban thriller or a detective novel and things like this that's moving at a really fast clip, a Michael Crichton book, you will often see that you get like one line of description for a setting or for a person. And you got to pack as much in there as you can get in there and use a lot of precise words in your one-line description. And if it's a detective novel, often it's also got to be funny. The description makes you chuckle a little bit. And you get this whole thing into your description, like when you're describing a person. In an epic fantasy, Robert Jordan would often use 3 sentences to describe that same person. So you've got that extra room. What you don't want to do is a lot of new writers I see to describe that person, they take 3 paragraphs. All right? If you can imagine Robert Jordan, who is considered really verbose by a lot of people, with like, wow, his description, he describes so much, and he's using often like 3 sentences. How are you doing in 4 paragraphs of doing the same thing? You understand suddenly that this is something you need to practice, and you really, really want to cut down. All right? So trimming, being precise, these are your goals, even if you're doing stained glass prose. Whichever one you're doing, precision and trimming. Now, for me in window pane, I am looking for clarity first. This is number 1. I'm going to trim and cut down to keep myself clear. I'm also looking to evoke character and something about the setting in every description that I do, if I can. You want to do multiple things with each line. So a great description of a room is the one where the character, you're describing the corgis, and the character hates dogs. And so, or the character's really nervous that this is going to ruin their meeting with the queen, or something like this. You are giving the character's emotional state and who they are by describing the corgi. And in fantasy, you also, say, oh, the corgi had been hit by a color-changing spell of this style. You can say something about the character and the magic and the setting all at the same time. That's what you want to do. Pack it all in there if you can. You had a comment or question?
Can you pack it down too much?
Yes, you can. It happens way more rarely than the other way, but it can happen. Where I've seen this happen is when short story writers transition to novels, and they just don't give anything, because in a short story you've got to be so sparse. And then you get this novel writer where they're like, giving, half of a line about everything. You're like, I can't imagine any of this because I'm picking up a novel. I want to be able to do all of this. So, do you want one of these things? Sure. Okay. What do you want? So it is. All right. Any other questions on prose as we're going along? Because there's a few more things that I'm going to talk about. All right. So, info dumps. All right. You, as a writer, by the way, what time do we have, Isaac? 6:02. Great. So, you as a writer have all of this interesting stuff about your world you have designed, and you need to be able to get this all across to the reader. Number one, you probably don't need to get across to them as much as you think you need to get across to them, okay? I would say that's rule number one, is probably you want to err on leaving it out, particularly as a newer writer. Your readers will let you know when they are confused. This is the importance of alpha and beta readers. They will tell you. That doesn't mean, don't take this rule too far, guys, all right? You do want to be giving indications and hints. Here's an example of a time when someone didn't, when someone left out too much. Dan has said that the number one complaint he gets about the John Cleaver books, which are stories about a young sociopath who discovers there's a demon in town killing people, and he has to turn on his serial killer superpowers to go kill the demon. The number one complaint he gets is that when people about halfway through the book realize that the killer is supernatural, they put the book down. Because a certain number of people have picked up that book thinking that it is a crime novel only, and when the supernatural elements get in, they're thrown for such a loop that it bothers them. This happened much more in the earlier drafts, and in the later drafts he tried to add more and more, but even still he says that's the number one complaint he gets about the book. And in that case, he left out too much. If he would have found a way, and he said he wishes he would have found a way to work more indication in the first few chapters that there were supernatural elements to this world, so that when the reader got to the demons, they were not completely blindsided. Okay? There's an example. But in general, I find that new writers try to stuff too much in. This is a holdover from the days, earlier in epic fantasy in particular, where we would have this big, boring, I'm sorry, David Eddings, I love you, but big, boring prologue that explains the history of the world that is just like, oh my goodness, do we have to read all this stuff? He got better as he went along, but you'll see these things in early fantasy books. It's like everyone felt they had to put in this big, long, boring, and they're actually not that long. They're only 3 pages, but you're like, can I get to the story? Okay. Prologue that explains the entire world and its history to you. And this sort of thing just doesn't cut it anymore. The genre's progressed. Readers are more sophisticated. They do not want to read a 3-page info dump at the beginning of your story. They want character and conflict immediately. And then they want you to work in setting information as you are dealing with the character and conflict right at the beginning. You will still find the prologue to be a kind of fantasy old standby. I like to use them myself. But be aware that you want those to be, if possible, either very short or very active themselves. I like David Farland's got a great example of a prologue in the prologue to the first Rune Lords book, in which it's about a different character. It's not your main character, And in the prologue, somebody gets murdered over an important book piece of information. And what this prologue is doing is it's indicating to you as a reader, hey, this is a book in which there is magic, because he uses the magic, and people are going to die, there's going to be fighting and action. And then, because chapter 1 is, here's our main character, and he's like buying something at the market. And that prologue kind of gets across to you this idea. So the idea is that on that case, you want to set your tone, all right? As very early as possible in the book, set the type of book it's going to be by the type of prose you're using. And then you also want to be unintrusive. Well, how do we be unobtrusive? Let's ask you guys. Have you seen this done? How do writers, and I want you to start really paying attention to this when you read books from now on, how do writers that you like get across information about their world in a way that is interesting to you and it is unobtrusive?
I like what Pat Ross did with his magic in the Wind, where he had both lecturing in front of a class, but he's been arguing with the teachers, he's showing off for him.
Yeah.
It's got so many layers of action happening.
Right.
But it's a lecture.
It's a lecture that is broken up and filled with character moments and things like this. That one works real well. How else have you seen it done?
This might not be like specifically, but it's like I feel like everything can be pretty boring, but as soon as you put like someone's personal perspective on it, like the character how they see it, it makes it a lot interesting as you get to know the person.
Okay. So yes, adding that lens, that layer. Let's go ahead and put that one up here as a great one. The viewpoint lens. All right. I'll talk more about that one. Let's go right here.
Make it very natural. Like,
Okay. Yeah. I like that one too. Go ahead. You were saying more.
like they're having a conversation that's just something like me and friends have. Like they want to tell about religion in the story. Have two friends having a conversation about religion.
Or even better, an argument about religion. Yes. But it's got to be very natural. We've talked about this idea before. We talked about it several weeks ago. But let's go ahead with other suggestions.
Setting can help.
Okay.
Megan Whelan Turner starts out with her main character in a prison that used to be kind of a temple of the gods. And so
Okay.
she tells us up front that the gods are part of this.
Right. Okay. Excellent. What else do we got in the back?
I'm thinking back in Bartimaeus, where you don't know much about the spirit world or where Bartimaeus comes from, but when you as a reader get to the point where you absolutely need to know about Tony and the backstory of Bartimaeus, you didn't need to know it for most of it. But when the need matches, that's when it's important.
Yeah, I think I talked about this in my other prose lecture. The need to know, holding off the information until it's needed to know. Now, this is a balance between your setting of tone, okay? Because at some points, you need to front load some of this information to say, this is a book in which knowing how the magic works is going to be very important to you. Therefore, if you're picking this up and reading chapter 1, we're going to include some magic discussion in order to set that tone for you. But holding off on too much of it until later on is very useful. Yeah.
Let's see. Using details about the setting and what the actions communicate things.
Okay.
The example I'm thinking of is the We Free Men.
Yeah.
It's set in a rural town, and there are teachers who travel from time to town teaching, but they're essentially like teachers themselves are uneducated. They're basically begging for food. This shows that the area is not super into education.
Right. Right. So what you want to be doing here, let's talk about this idea. So you guys have these things. So in real writing terms, my suggestion to you when you're like, I need to get across this stuff about the setting. This is going to be important for the plot. It's important for the character. No, it's important to set the tone. I want all these things in here. Avoid the paragraphs that look like this on the page when someone opens it up. Okay? That's not to say you always should avoid those, or you should never have those, but I would say avoid that. Think about, if this all is world building, there are some books that that's appropriate for. As I've mentioned to you guys, I'm still reading Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, And there's a lot of this. And that is just how that book is. And the more books you write, by the way, the more you realize that certain books, their strength is also their weakness, and there is nothing you can do to get rid of that weakness. When you write the book, we talk about this in writing groups sometimes. We'll talk about and say, this is this book's issue. In order to fix this issue, I would have to make it not be this book. For Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, big, thick paragraphs of description and setting, and really about the magic and stuff, are part of what makes the book work. It is also the thing that makes the most people not finish the book. So be aware that I'm not trying to get you to write cookie-cutter stories where they're all exactly the same, all following this one style of writing. I'm trying to say do things deliberately and be aware of what the costs. These sorts of things, particularly at the beginning of the book, are going to say to your reader, steep learning curve, dense prose, reader beware. Okay? Whereas if they come in and they see something like little paragraph of evocative description talking about the senses, followed by quotes. Oh, people talking. Oh, that's cool. Oh, another paragraph here. Okay. And then a few more little paragraphs because someone's doing something. This kind of indicates someone's doing something. Yeah. They're going around. There's different people doing things. And then some more quotes at the end. They look at that page. They're like, oh, this is a fast-moving book. This is a book where people are having conversations, where things are happening. Now, you don't want to just cheat. But if when they read that book, your goal is, by the end of this page, if you went and said to that reader and started quizzing them about the characters in the world, they'd be able to answer your questions. And they would almost be surprised. Oh, I know this about the world. Oh, I know this takes place in a steampunk world, and I know that they have, airships, and I know that our main character really wants to be a ship captain, and I know all of this stuff, but that's not what this was about. It was not a conversation, even though this is a good one, it was not a conversation about how I want to be a ship captain. It was a conversation about, I need to buy a new horse, and arguing with the horse merchant. And after that, you know all of these things, then you've really done something good. Then you've started with conflict. You have got across character and setting by what the character is doing in their natural life, and you are having this all come together. That's what I call the grand skill when I talk about it. When an editor or a new reader picks up your book and they read a few pages, and you have slipped all of these world details in here through the way that people are talking and whatnot, then you are really doing something. If you're doing that with character too, I can guarantee if you do this and you have evoked character and setting without having this scene be about the character or the setting, every editor in New York will keep reading. Okay? Now it'll come to what I was talking about earlier. Putting it all together in a novel is a lot harder. But your first job is to keep them reading to prove that you can do it. This is what you need to do. Now, first person, those you're writing first person, helps you cheat on these sections a little bit. But third person lets you get away with other things that we talked about before. So practice this. Seriously. If there's one thing that you can practice day by day, it is making every scene that you do have this sort of thing where we're showing rather than telling. What do I mean by show versus tell? Did we talk about this during the other week? Yeah, we talked about it. Okay, good. Where you are, instead of saying, maybe we'll do this next week. I was actually going to pull up some examples of prose and let you guys, so what we're going to do next week is I'll get some examples of prose, and I will bring them to you, and we will try to do this to them instead of what they are already, okay? It's going to be fun. I might even bring some of mine in, okay? I'll probably ask the workshop class if we can steal their prose. And we will practice on making this, because this is something every writer can practice. All right? All right. What time do we have now? We got like 6:15. Do we go to 25 after? Okay. So let's do a few more questions. Right here.
So with the whole setting tone,
Yes.
how can we start with like an exciting scene, but then go into like some slower paced stuff? Because you sort of did that in Warbreaker and
Yeah.
I thought it worked a lot better in Way of Kings, but I don't know why.
I don't know why either. Most people would say that they thought it went better in Warbreaker than Way of Kings. But yeah. I would say in that case it's just personal taste. The prologue is kind of this crutch that we use in fantasy writing. It's a great tool, but it's also a little bit of a crutch. It allows us that when you pick up a book and it says prologue on it, number one, some people skip the prologue. Anyone here just skip the prologues? Yeah. There's the same with the population. It always just skips a prologue. So be aware, sometimes they won't let you have this tool. But what the prologue says to those who read it is, this is probably separated by viewpoint and or time from what's going to come next. And so in Way of Kings, using prologues, as I did, says to the reader, this is going to be interesting for the setting and the world and these characters, but these are not who the story is about. It's become a bit of a cliche, so you have to use it wisely. I don't want to speak ill. I'm not trying to pick on anyone specific, but the prologue that starts with a baby being rescued or in some way and then fostered out, and then 18 years later, that's the main character, is like one of the most used prologues in all of fantasy. And every year in my class, I have like 2 or 3 people who write that's their prologue or their first chapter. That doesn't mean you can't do it well, because that's what Harry Potter did, okay? And Harry Potter's a fantastic book. But you've got to be aware that if you use these same ones over and over, you've really got to use them in a way that makes them stand out. I was using the prologue. I'm like, here is what the tone of the book is going to be, but our first chapters, guys, are going to be kind of depressing because Kaladin's in prison. He's a slave. It's going to be a kick to the face. But here's all this cool stuff that I promise you're going to get to once you've earned it, which is kind of cheating. But I can cheat a little bit more because I have the name recognition. People have read my books and they trust that I'm actually going to make good on it. Things like a character trapped as a slave is like a great, cool archetype that I love, unless the reader doesn't make good on it later on. And if they trust you, that you will, then you can do things more easily. What do you want? You want Zeth. Okay. Zeth is now gone. We have Syl. Oh, wait. There's one hiding back there. So we do have another Zeth. Okay. There was another question way in the back. Okay. Yeah, too carried away with showing. I get this. This is interesting. I get this from my YA editor way more than my adult editor, where I felt like I've shown a scene and don't need to show what the character's emotional reaction. And the YA editor's like, so what's he feeling right here? And I don't know if that's a difference between the editors or a difference between the genres, but I do get that sometimes too. And I find that I like to use the character thought trope, right? Or the tool. It's not really a trope, but the idea of the character's thoughts directly in quotes. Or not in quotes, in italics, where it's like I start a paragraph with yada, 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 Vin thought. Yada, yada, yada. And that's all underlined or italicized, really. It's all in italics. And then we go into a paragraph that kind of explains that. And I use her thoughts like dialogue to break up really what she's musing over or thinking about. So the character thought can be something that the reader's like, what is your character's reaction to this? Breaking into it with what they're actually thinking or feeling is often what I think readers are wanting there. So they're like, you're showing all this, but I want to know the character. I want to feel what they actually think. So you can actually put it in thoughts. You don't have to, but you can. And using a first-person viewpoint helps with this a lot. But you don't always want to just do first person. So try adding in some thoughts. Try adding in some feelings. Okay? What do you want? This is the last cell. Here, pass it back to him. I don't want to walk all the way back there. All right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, that's not really what show versus tell usually in a writing terms is used to mean. Usually in writing terms, when someone says show, don't tell, show, it's the sort of thing where you say, where your tell is, he was lonely. And you wrote that. That's a tell. You're telling me he's lonely. That can be just fine. The thing to remember about show versus tell, which I think I mentioned before, is you can't always show. You got to have this balance between. But the show for he's lonely is having him pick up the picture of his ex-girlfriend who dumped him and sitting there and staring at it and then, starting an email to her and then deleting it, which gives a very different, it means, what does that mean? That tells you the specific type of loneliness, tells you why he's lonely, tells you what's going on. Or, you show the character sitting in the lunchroom by themselves and listening to the conversation that's happening at the next table over and just kind of whispering to himself what he would say if he were part of that conversation and chuckling to himself, but being too shy to go join with them. That shows a very different character. Oh, see, that you get an on that one. With the he is lonely, you don't. And so you are looking for ways to set up your story in such a way that you can. Readers like to be able to infer these things about the character. And when they do infer them, they have a stronger emotional connection. And when you can see it as it's happening rather than just being told it, you also have a stronger emotional connection to the character. It usually forces you as a writer to make a scene or a little explanation of what's going on and who this character is, rather than just taking the shortcut, which was he was a lonely man. He was lonely. Sometimes you do want to use this, but those shows are really powerful things that, when you learn to use them correctly, will create an emotional impact for your reader. All right, over here.
I'm wondering if you have any rules of thumb for doling out clues to your readers in your mystery subplots.
Mystery subplots, doling out clues. Dave's mentioned it 3 times before it becomes relevant. Works pretty well. Test readers are really important because I usually suggest, rule of thumb, err on the side of being a little more obvious than you think you need to be, because readers generally, because you know the whole thing, things you think are huge clues are only minor clues to a lot of readers, and then see how quickly they pick it up. And make sure that you're giving red herrings and things like this, but mention something a few times. It just depends on the pacing of your story, right? If your story, you can have a mystery plot that is paced technically like the Da Vinci Code is a mystery plot, right? And the Da Vinci Code is kind of plotted like mini mystery, mini mystery, mini mystery, mini mystery. And that's how they pull you through. And so in this, you get clue, 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 answer, clue, 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 answer, clue, 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 answer. Or really, clue, 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 question, clue, 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 question. But really, that's how it's pulling you through this plot. Whereas a whodunit mystery is a different style where it's mostly focused on this, where it's little clue, little clue, little clue, distraction, no, back up, little clue, things like that. So what is the pacing of your story? How often, that'll indicate how often. But you need to give this sense of progression and need to be indicating we're moving toward our answer. All right, what do you want? Kolos or Zeph? Kolos it is. Here, will you pass one of these back? All right, let's do one more. Go for it. Trust your reader. Readers are better at picking up show versus tell, picking up tell or shows than you think. Shows can do a lot more than you think they will. They are worse in general at picking up clues about the entire story arc than you think they will be, because you have all the information and they may not be reading the book all in one sitting and all of these different things. Remember, you can't fool everyone. And if you do, you've probably written a bad book, which means you just have a completely, now not necessarily, but you have a completely 180 in the middle where it's like, this makes no sense to anybody. So what the perfect reveal for me as an author to get is when the majority of readers are figuring it out around the paragraph or two before it comes out, but really worried that their writer excited their right. where that if I do that, that means that like 10% of the readers have figured it out chapters and chapters ago. And another like 25% of the readers don't figure it out until a chapter later where I go into depth about what just happened. But the majority of the readers are like there on the page being like, oh, is it oh? And then it happens. And that's what I shoot for. Getting that balance down for yourself is going to depend, you're just going to have to experiment, okay? All right, what do you want, Zeth or Kolos? Kolos it is. All right, let's go ahead and break for the week. I will try to bring writing samples we can play with next time. Bring up your little thingamaboppers. Have a good week.